getting to hear from all of you online for one last time for 2020, which has been quite the eventful year to say the least. So today is pretty free flow. Feel free to jump on chat, say hi to each other, and also send through any questions or comments or topics you want us to get into. Otherwise, you'll just have our ramblings. And what we plan to talk about are our thoughts on the year that has been and our predictions for 2021. So I am very pleased to be joined by my co-host, Kahlil Philander from Washington State University, as well as our return guest expert, Dr. Brett Abarbanel from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And of course, I am Sally Gainsbury from the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney, and we have huge thanks to the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney for hosting this webinar, particularly on the short notice that we threw all this together. So welcome. Grab yourselves a drink, and we're going to get straight into it. Brett, since you're already trying to cut me off, why don't you have a chat first about what your thoughts have been on 2020?
So that was an error. I was trying to close the YouTube feed so it didn't clash with our separate feed. I think 2020 has been such an interesting year. There's so many things that are easy to say, but that everyone has really already experienced. It's one of those years where simply having made it through the year is a huge success. And I think that that's something that can't be understated. Everyone has had struggles, even if you live in a place that has gone sort of through the curve of a pandemic faster than other countries, like my own continues to live through. And I think that it's really taken a toll on everything, especially the research that we do, whether it be a lack of funding sources, because suddenly everyone was very cautious about what needed to be available for existence, in addition to simply funding research that might be out there, as well as completely changing the research questions that we ask. We can't really look at gambling through a normal lens anymore. We're going to be looking through this COVID lens for years to come. And so I'm really quite curious to see how much and how long this lens is going to need to be applied to the research questions that we ask, so that we can finally get to a place where we understand what normal is and how much that has changed due to what we've been through so far.
I think that's really interesting, because I've kind of gone full circle and come out a little bit on the other side. Probably, as you say, that my backdrop is Coogee Beach in Sydney, and that's pretty much what it looks like at the moment. We have come through and come out the other side pretty unscathed, and we're in a very fortunate position. But we did jump on pretty quickly and throw together a COVID survey. So we did a 3-wave follow-up. I think we surveyed 760 people in May. Getting ethics and getting all that approval was quite the jump through in hoops. But we got that out. We did a second wave in August, which at the time, most of it, the country was still in a very cautious place, but Victoria was in deep lockdown. And then we did another one in November, at which stage most of the country was relatively open, although we have restrictions between borders. But, there's been really interesting learnings. But I almost think that what we have is about COVID, it's such a once in a lifetime event that it's almost like, well, it's not hopefully going to happen again. What can we really learn from this? And so my takeaway has been looking at that research in terms of, well, what theoretically would happen if there was some massive policy change that, got rid of gambling overnight. So I'm looking at it more from what are the implications for similar policies as opposed to what's the impact of COVID specifically, because we've already pretty much bounced back to similar, if not higher revenues than normal.
Yeah, I wonder, so when it sort of first started, and everybody starting to think about, okay, well, this is like a great opportunity to study something, and a lot of people were scrambling to just start doing COVID related research and everything, including gambling. And then, but I'm starting to think some of that research might just be entirely disposable. And I wonder, not certain that it wasn't worth studying or interesting, but that we're not going to be able to use that much in the future. It's not going to give us any sort of long-term insights or contribute too much to theory. And I wonder in some ways if this was a little bit of a lost year for gambling research, because, I think a great example is like some of the work that you and I have been collaborating on, Sally, where, you know, we had planned to do a bunch of experiments using these devices in your lab. And then, you know, because we couldn't access people and because I couldn't travel to Australia and many other reasons, we couldn't do like some of the follow-up studies we wanted to do. And, you know, you're still productive, you're still working, doing other papers, but we're not still marching in that same direction that we were before. And so some of this is going to be a little bit lost. Where I do think we could have some other interesting insights is if people can figure out how can we take some of the data that happened during COVID and then pre and post, and then really try to tease out this in a natural experiment way, which is really challenging because it wasn't just about that gambling shutdown. It was also that people lost their jobs and then they were dropping, you know, money from helicopters in the sky to try to support the economy. And like, you couldn't leave your house. So how does that change like other substitutionary activities? And so like, I think if clever researchers can figure out how to navigate through those issues, we might actually get some really interesting insights from this natural experiment.
I think that's a fair point, and perhaps it's just where I am. Maybe now this assumption that some, for example, Western countries have so much in common is no longer going to stand, because, you know, obviously several of these countries, all of the countries around the world approached this in very, very different ways. And so when I talk about the pandemic, it's so different from the way that Sally that you've just described this in terms of an event that has happened. For us, it's still very much happening. And so the potential longitudinal effects of this sort of event, not just on gambling behavior, but also on the businesses themselves and the broader entertainment mix that surrounds them. So for example, for such a long time, one of the things that we've talked about in terms of sort of the harmfulness of the way that gambling is provided, sort of the worst case being the kind of box of slots, and the best case being this very, very broad entertainment mix where you have the casino, but you also have the hotel and the swimming pool and the shows and the Universal Studios and everything that goes into this integrated resort concept. So much of that now is struggling with the casinos themselves, at least here in Las Vegas, and certainly with a lot of other resort facilities really all around the world. And so I'm quite curious to see how those sorts of discussions are going to change, or if they change, as we continue forward with this. For example, in Japan, is this going to change the way that the new Japanese integrated resorts are going to be planned out? Are we going to take into account social distancing needs? Are we going to have different mask requirements? Are you going to see the entrances to some of these facilities changed because it's going to require that they have different testing needs as people enter in, because maybe they're coming from a place like the US as opposed to a place like Australia? So I'm really curious to see how that impacts these broader resorts and how that then in turn has an effect on some of the gambling elements as well.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see the response from regulators and the industry. And there was a lot of scramble to move machines further apart, so they're all 1.5 meters apart, and set up, okay, we can immediately set up temperature screening. So we're screening every single person. And so here in Australia, once venues reopened, we have a real check-in procedure. So you scan a QR code and you register, because we have a high degree of contact tracing. So all the venues, like every shop, restaurant, retail, whatever. So the venues are all scanning, getting not ID, but everyone has to register essentially to come in.
Mm-hmm.
But at no stage was this tied to self-exclusion, which seems like the most obvious thing in the entire world. You have a list of people's names that can't come into the venues. Every single person is being required to sign in. And at no point were these two lists joined up. I mean, it's to my mind, obviously, with that bias of responsible gambling and harm prevention, I'm thinking, okay, great. So you've now taken machines that were in one part of the venue, like you're saying, and not in the retail and the entertainment and the restaurant. You've now spread them out everywhere. So gambling is completely accessible to people no matter what they were planning to do in the venue, including in like the foyer. So you're literally seeing it, as opposed to being in a room where someone can monitor, make sure they're watching everybody, seeing the kind of the to and fro. And you're not checking for self-exclusion. So my question is, like, if it's obviously so easy, well, not easy, but the industry and the government have been able to get things ready to be able to re-enter in a safe way, why can't these actions be taken with the responsible gambling lens on at the same time?
Yeah, that makes no sense. I mean,
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So one of the conversations I think that's often used as a little bit of a straw man argument against entry control in self-exclusion programs is that it'll just create total chaos at the entrance, and it's just not something that can be managed physically. And so you see a lot of, well, I don't know if it's a lot of investment, but some investment that's like, we're going to kick this can down the road and say that we're going all in on facial rec or license plate readers or other tools besides just that entry control piece. Again, I think that is a little bit of a straw man, but I think what's interesting about this is, as you describe it, and I don't know what it actually looks like there, but it sounds like one of those arguments is being taken away, which is like, we definitely can do it. It's not that crazy.
Yeah, everyone is so on board. Everyone's so compliant with it. It's a complete non-issue. And it doesn't really slow things down. So yeah, it's been removed as an issue, but it's like that happened in June. It's now December, and they still haven't been linked up, as far as I'm aware. And obviously I'm not aware of every single venue, but there certainly hasn't been any government effort to say, okay, you should actually link these two records together.
I have a speculation on this front. I wonder if, and obviously stop me if I'm wrong, the safety protocols that are going into place for COVID are coming from a different government agency than the one that would be implementing these self-exclusion protocols. And I wonder if this is a means of communicating between government agencies and how that might be facilitated, and who fills that role to be able to ensure that something that's being put into place like this can then be tied to a self-exclusion program, since to the three of us, obviously, this seems like a no-brainer.
That's right. And so I'm certainly not the person saying I know what goes on behind the scenes. I am aware that sometimes, researchers can get on our high horses and say, well, obviously, just flick the switch, make that happen. But I do think, we should be putting as much focus on responsible gambling, given that, as you said, Kahlil, this isn't just a time of change to gambling. This is a time of extreme financial distress, psychological distress, ongoing economic hardship. So while we've come out of it here in Australia, there's still, our stimulus packages are now being wound right back. And that, the jobs haven't been replaced. So there's still a lot of people in a lot of very, very difficult situation. And coming, after the holidays, I expect there'll be a kind of a really big uptick, because the first few months, all the banks, utilities, you got deferrals on everything. That's now all being wound back. So I think that we'll actually see a new wave in financial hardship and psychological stress to some extent, as life looks like normal, but people are not in their normal previous conditions. But anyway, so I think that's 2020 and COVID. And
for the central bankers to figure out.
Yeah, we're not going to solve all the problems, but like you say, Kahlil, I think it's for us as researchers and running our own research centers, looking forward and thinking, okay, do we kind of pick up where we were this time last year, or have we pivoted to a new area? Has this changed the research landscape?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Brett, because you were probably the person, at least on this call, who was most dialed into like the internet 2.0 new economy of gambling, as far as it like is changing the consumer experience.
It's interesting that you say that. It's been a weird dichotomy in my research world. I've thrown out research proposals. They will never see the light of day again because they are no longer relevant. They were extremely relevant in February, and now they're in the trash. At the same time, like you said, I don't know if I call it internet 2.0, but I'm digging this. I might continue down that track. Everything that has been in my world in the sphere of video games, esports, blockchain and cryptocurrency has just gone through the roof. There are immense increases in not just online gambling activity, but when we focus in on some of these specifics, things like esports betting, crypto betting, there's been a lot of trading. Just the other day, I had gotten into bed with my husband at the end of the day. It was like 9 p.m., which means it's, by the way, midnight on the East Coast. And my father-in-law, who lives on the East Coast, called, and I can hear my husband pick up the phone going like, oh, hello, what's going on? He's like, hey, can we talk about Bitcoin? And so this discussion, this now, and I don't want to throw my father-in-law under the bus, but he is a boomer. And this subject is extremely, extremely common. And this has become a huge subject. This is a market that one can follow and trade within. These trades very much fitting within a lot of not just social, but financial definitions of gambling as well. And so this is something that has really exploded in the ways in which that people are spending and able to spend their money. I wouldn't necessarily say there's been a huge change in how it's possible, but there's definitely been a big shift in what's going on since the pandemic, a shift away from things like cash. For such a long time, it was just, it felt like just America was lagging behind everybody. But even now in America, this move toward cashless, for example, has become a huge, huge subject. If we go back to the springtime in Nevada, for example, the idea of cashless payments at casinos had been kind of debated at the regulatory board and then perhaps in legislation for about 2.5 to 3 years. Once the pandemic hit, it was approved within 12 days. So there was a huge, huge shift in interest from regulators to try and keep up with everything that's been going on, because this has been something that has very much changed the way that we're able to interact and able to spend our money. And then, of course, related to this, how we gamble.
Yeah, and then we've seen that as well. There are now some venues that so retail or dining venues that are entirely contactless, and we're pretty good adopters of this in Australia. So you tap on your e-wallets and cards. I think someone asked me to enter a PIN yesterday. I'm like, oh, that's been a while. I have to have a think about that. So we're pretty much on that bandwagon. But again, cash has been a holdout for venues. It's almost like the one activity that you actually need cash for. And so we're also seeing a similar pivot and interest. But in Australia, we do have, fortunately, regulators that do have a really strong responsible gambling lens on. So they're thinking, oh, what are the risks of this? Is this going to facilitate unplanned, impulsive, excessive expenditure? Really, what are the checks and balances that need to be put in place? But I think there are a lot of advantages, and it was actually offered as one of the alternatives to facial recognition, because like if everyone has to be registered to play with a card or with some kind of account base, then you don't need facial recognition or even entering into the venue recognition, because you won't be able to physically put money onto a device with an account that is tied to a self-exclusion register. So I think personally from our research group, we've really leaned into this digital cash in both the conceptual idea of how do consumers think about money? Does it change the salience of how they spend? To the more practical of what would we do as an intervention to offset some of the risks that we know will be there based on the existing research on cashless payments?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not, like if you're a regulator or if you're an operator, or even if you're a researcher and you're still building your ideas on top of like a cash-based paradigm of the way that interactions occur in the physical gambling environment, like you don't have a future, because that's not how anybody is going to transact even like 5 years in the future. And you can see, like a quick transition now, and this is just kind of in response to an issue, but if you look at markets where they've kind of skipped the generation of banking that we've had in the United States, and you look at a place like China, I think their mobile transaction payments are like 4x or 5x their actual GDP, because they skipped cash, and that's just going to be the future of all transactions. And we kind of screwed up in thinking that cash was like a reliable way to structure a responsible gambling program by encouraging breaks in play. But like the analogy I use is if your critical intervention for keeping people from taking out more money in a hot state is forcing them to walk off the casino floor to access an ATM, you might as well just force them to do like 3 laps of the blackjack table and then like let them use their card at the table, because like that's exactly the same intervention. And so as where I think people need to be focused is what's going to be the on-ramp to the financial system from casinos or like other retail gaming environments. And from where we stand right now, it's probably some sort of mix of, a direct app or a super app linked perhaps to, most likely it's going to be a mobile wallet. And then where does that mobile wallet link out to? I think the questions for gambling regulators and maybe even operators too is, does gaming have a unique mobile wallet, or are we plugged into another mobile wallet? And I think this becomes like a critical question from the regulation standpoint, because a gaming regulator can actually control that gaming technology. So if it's a mobile wallet that is a gaming only mobile wallet, well, then they can exert more control over that than they could over something like Apple Pay or, the Cash App or Venmo or whatever else it gets used.
And I think that's the kind of thing that is really going to come into play as we think about how these different technologies talk to one another. Because if you go to China, they're probably not using Google Pay, which I do in America, but they're using WeChat Pay, which I'm not in America. And so if, let's say I go to China or someone from China comes to the US, what are we going to do with regard to gambling? And I'm realizing this example is painting myself into a corner. Let's just assume I'm going to Macau. So Macau has adapted very quickly to typical Chinese payment systems because they've had to. A huge number of their tourists come from mainland China. It remains to be seen if certain other parts of the world are going to be able to adapt to those technologies. So we may set something up that is a gambling specific app to help control the wallet, but is that something that are going to be able to bring across jurisdictions? Are we going to be able to implement it in a meaningful way for a visitor from a different jurisdiction? So I'm curious if that's the sort of thing that will be more beneficial locally, or if it's something that we can make global. I honestly don't know what the answer is to that.
And I think that's what we're struggling with at the moment. We're kind of leaning in on the theoretical understanding of it because we don't know what the practical solution exactly is going to look like. And in some ways, that's going to be driven very heavily by the regulators and the technology suppliers. Mm-hmm. I like the idea, though, of wearable devices, Kahlil, and having to maybe have like a corner somewhere where people have to go and do like yoga for 5 minutes or like push-ups and sit-ups or a boxing bag before they can like re-access any further funds. I think that maybe you've got an idea there.
Well, you can run that study. It's all yours. It's fine.
But maybe it does raise a tongue in cheek with that one. But as obviously I've had a hard lean on technology, and maybe what I think this pandemic does show us is that we can throw the rule book out and reimagine and really reinnovate, because we've seen how well venues can adapt if they had to. If you have to do this, then they'll make it happen. Maybe we can like reset, and this has never been done before, but that doesn't mean it never will, and really start to be a lot more innovative in what the requirements are. Consumers have adapted, regulators have adapted, industry have adapted. I think we can start a little bit from scratch and start to think not just incremental changes, but what can we fundamentally pivot towards that would be helpful for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the last great innovation in responsible gambling was self-exclusion like 30 or 35 years ago. I don't, like what's really happened since then besides, marginal changes. People have experimented, but I don't think that anything has necessarily shown evidence that it's actually too helpful aside from that. And then just kind of like broader education about risks. I don't know that anything's happened. And I think, like where there's an opportunity is in creating I don't think anybody knows where it's coming from. And I think we have to, as a field and like as a larger group involving the industry and regulators and everyone else, have to figure out how do we let 1,000 flowers bloom and create the right incentive structure for more innovation to happen. And it's just like, like I look at myself or even you two on the call, and I would think, and you have enough knowledge, aptitude, and expertise to actually be able to develop, a startup business that might do something very innovative. And, plenty of the people who watch this seminar, I think, are in the same place. But the way that the market is set up right now, there's just like absolutely no incentive to do something like that. Like, I mean, the returns that you would get from, just focusing, in a one single area and doing incremental work. I mean, that you just way better off doing that than just trying to do something experimental that might spin off into something else. There's no prize to be won when it comes to responsible gambling. You could develop like a really nice solution, but have a hell of a time trying to sell it into any business anywhere in the world. And I think maybe like the one place that's starting to turn the corner a little bit now is the UK. And they've done that with, that more of a stick than a carrot in handing out fines. And now there's like an incentive for people to make improvements. But even I think in that case, there's not the incentive to improve your program and do well. It's just an incentive not to screw up. And so like, as I'm talking more to regulators, and I mean, I think this also has to happen at the legislative level. I think we need to start thinking more creatively about how we can actually encourage people to actually do good and get better. And so I think that comes down to being able to track the right things that are really important. And I think as a field, that's something that we really need to focus on. And then once we know what we're tracking, what we're trying to improve, then we can start saying, well, like if you get this number down, then maybe we can give you a break on your gross gaming revenue tax, because it's going to have a much better outcome for society as a whole and improve social welfare. This is just kind of like a broad rant, but I promised a rant on this call. So.
No, I think it makes sense. And I think as well as having incentives from regulators, we should be focusing on trying to get the consumers to be incentivizing operators, because I have seen that as there's the products have become more and more similar, as there's been restrictions in some jurisdictions on marketing incentives and promotions and bonuses and that kind of thing. So it essentially forces a lot more uniform product to be available. And consumers aren't that sensitive to price, and there's not that much variation between odds, things like that anyway. That the point I've been arguing that the point of differentiation should be consumer protection, but probably painted more as consumer control. So giving consumers greater ability to customize their play to ensure that they're sort of a safer play. And I think customers, at least a segment of customers, do appreciate that, if not for themselves, then for other people as well. So I think that there should be a push towards getting the consumers to be looking at that as a commercial focus and selecting operators based on their provision of innovative consumer protection measures. And then that will then in turn force the operators to start responding to that demand. I'm not quite sure exactly how to achieve that, but that's where I'd go, because then you're getting consumers to look for those as well.
I think that's a really interesting concept. And I think one of the things that we have to overcome to make that feasible as a point of competition is geographic location. So I think that that's the sort of thing that will be extremely valuable for online gambling, but might be a lot harder to use as a market differentiator when you are a land-based operator. Because the example we give is that, and we've seen this in research, is that proximity to the casino has an effect on your choice of where you go to place a bet, or if you're even choosing to place a bet. And so if you have something as convenient as walking to the corner and being able to place a wager, are you going to go a few kilometers away to place a bet at a place that has a better consumer control option for you? Some people will, but the convenience factor is going to be a really tough one to overcome. So I think that if this is the sort of experimental phase or direction rather that you want to go to, and I think that online gambling is the way to do that. Before I turn it over, though, I do want to emphasize some of the questions that we've been getting in the chat. One, Julie, please email me. I have a couple of papers that have come from operators, esports betting operators themselves, that have outlined some of their trends in betting during COVID. And then I also see that Julie has asked Kahlil where his Festivus poll is. So I want to make sure that that gets addressed as well. And then there are a couple other really interesting questions here too.
Yeah, so getting back to Sally's question about like the consumer perspective, Brett always just plugging her own work. It's ridiculous. I think there's I think a lot of merit in trying to focus on the consumer as like a long-term strategy. And the reason why I think that's the case is that gambling is increasingly becoming, and I think this is going to grow exponentially, it's becoming an untractable problem to deal with at a local level. Ever since Oliver actually came onto the seminar and started talking more about crypto casinos, and I think I'd heard about it like a couple of years ago, but then when he started talking about it, I started thinking about it more. And I think he's absolutely right. Like, internet gambling, there's no way that it doesn't move towards that model, because you can offer a better price. You can, just write a smart contract that's just going to match people up. Like if they're doing a sports wager, you can have an internet casino that is either advertising based or has like an exceptionally small house advantage. And the only thing that's preventing this is like people like Brett's stepdad, or not stepdad, sorry, father-in-law, who like haven't figured out how to like on-ramp into that whole blockchain world so far. But once that happens, it's just going to be hard for established incumbents to be able to compete, with just a few lines of code. And so like, that's like one piece. And then gambling is just turning into like all sorts of other things. And I think the example that I've talked about previously is, the whole idea of retail investing now, where, it started with, I think, E-Trade in like the 90s, where people became able to self-direct their investments in a brokerage account. And that kind of led to a little bit of a spike in risk taking. But then now in the past couple of years, you had this big innovation, which was transaction feeless trades in not only stocks, but also options, which are just, magnifying the element of risk. And with everybody working from home, I think this is like one of those things that, Brett, you were talking about earlier, of like what's going to wash out of COVID and fundamentally change the way that people interact. And the degree of risk taking by people on, some of these apps, like for those who are outside the United States, like Robinhood is a great example of one, or even like some of these mobile wallets, like the Cash App, where you can buy fractional shares in companies. It's just like the nature of gambling is moving well beyond any regulatory borders. And so when we think about how do we target that, it's going to be, like what are the pieces of technology that consumers are interacting with, and then what can be distributed directly to them in terms of ideas or technologies or management strategies.
Yeah, it gets to what I've always argued as a key part of consumer education, and particularly whenever we talk about youth education, which is teaching consumers critical insights and abilities, which shouldn't necessarily be the role of gambling regulators, but to get people, for example, and the Australian government has done an increasingly good job of trying to crack down on offshore operators, but there is this whole plethora of online casinos that say they're called G'day Casino, and they've got koalas and emus and stuff all over them. They're completely offshore, like, not even remotely legal in any sense to be providing their services. And I did a little bit of work on them, and I've even done some chats with them. So are you based in Australia? We are an Australian casino. So are you regulated in Australia? We are an Australian casino. They've got the company line there. But it shouldn't necessarily be the role of the gambling regulators. But at some point, I think you have to be able to enhance critical thinking amongst consumers, because there's only so much you can kind of take a paternalistic protection approach of, obviously, you shouldn't put your personal details on this really dodgy offshore site that's going to disappear with your funds and you will have no recourse. And if you do, don't come crying to us. And I think different jurisdictions take different approaches on that. But to me, that seems like something that we really need to fundamentally ramp up, is this idea of informed choice, but not in the way that it's been put in some places where we've got that really complicated brochure that tells you exactly how slot machine pay lines work, and like, clearly just follow the squiggly lines. Or like, I've got a 10-page legalese document that clearly explains all of the terms and conditions. We need to find a kind of happy medium of properly informing consumers and consumers seeking out that information. I think one of the, in the research world, we have these kind of truth detection strategies we can use, and one of them is, have you ever read the terms and conditions of, like every app you've downloaded? And anyone that says that is clearly lying, because no one would read that stuff. So trying to get consumers to a point where they're seeking the information, and then to operators to a point where information has been provided. So looking, for example, we did a study that's not yet published, but looking at, do consumers look for where a site is regulated? Do they look for the fact that sites are regulated anywhere? So trying to get consumers, and then making it like a point that to be regulated in this jurisdiction, you have to have a really clear banner somewhere that says that. So consumers start to look at that. So I think it's a little bit of both ways of getting consumers to the point they're seeking out and are able to critically evaluate the information before they engage, because there are some people that are just going to do risky and reckless things, but we need to get it so that's not the majority of people, or they're not doing it by accident.
I think that's a great point, Sally. And I'm always, whenever we talk about this subject, I'm always reminded of two things. And the first one is the potential normalization of offshore sites, starting with the early 2000s and even the late 1990s, when there were, and especially in the poker world, plenty of offshore online poker sites that consumers didn't really have problems with. When they thought that there was something wrong with their game, they would email customer service and it would be resolved immediately, usually by refunding your buy-in. I had that problem in the early 2000s, and that's how it was resolved. When you tried to cash out, you would receive a check. Now, the end user, for the most part, either didn't notice or didn't care that that check came from was it the tennis ball company is the big one in poker? Or for example, I once received, I think we're past the statute of limitations if it ever applied to consumers, but I once received a check from Encinitas, California, which was very strange to me because that's where I went to high school and I knew for sure there was no legal online poker in that city. So, but it didn't matter. My check came in the appropriate amount for the amount that I was trying to cash out. I never had any issues with this. When PokerStars, for example, which is now still a huge online operator who works throughout the world with now a number of regulated locations, including in the United States, they would set up their annual event in the Bahamas, and they would set up one of the ballrooms as the PokerStars bank. And you could go and cash out of your online account with cash in US dollars that you could then take back to the United States. And so in many ways, it was normalized that an offshore site could provide the exact same protections that one might think they would get from a regulated site. And so that's going to make it that much harder to convince people of sort of what to look for, what benefits they would get from a regulated site if they're perhaps already getting it from an offshore site. Now, obviously, not every site is going to be like that, but because some of those do or did exist, there is always going to be some chunk of the population that is expecting and doesn't really care where it's regulated because they're able to see that behavior from an offshore site. The other thing I always think about is the discussion that, again, we have regularly, which is on kind of who's responsible for providing this information. Because I see, especially in esports betting, it's not necessarily coming from the regulators to explain what's legal, what's not, what's regulated, what has oversight. I won't name names to, I guess, protect the guilty, but I saw on an esports media site recently, they were really trying to do good. They wrote an article about if you're going to place a bet on an esports event, how do you decide which site to use? And it wasn't just one of those, oh yeah, we're an affiliate, so click through our link. They actually went through a list of subjects like, do they have good odds? And are they a regulated site? Here's how you can check to see where their license is. And in that bullet point where they said, here's how you check where the license is, they said, for example, you want to check and make sure they have a license with an existing regulator. So you want to check, for example, if you see license number XYZ in Curacao, then you know that they have a license and they're good to go. And I was like, oh, the United States would have a shit fit at this. This is so wrong. But that's the sort of information that's then being provided. This was a huge esports media company. This isn't just Joe Schmo down the street. This has huge readership. And so that's one of those sources where information's going out. And so I wonder if there's another way that we can provide this kind of information and education that, like you said, Sally, doesn't necessarily rely on the gambling regulator.
Yeah, and so I advise anyone, and I'll quickly turn off it because we're getting a little bit off topic, but to check out New Zealand as my pick for the shining light in public education, and go onto YouTube. They've had a couple of just fantastic clips, but they had a public education campaign of a woman on the phone like, no mom, just because your cousin Doris said that you can drink bleach doesn't mean you should to get rid of COVID. And no mom, I know the internet said. And then they had another one just on general cybersecurity of like the mom opening up her door and there's two completely naked people there going, yeah, we're here for your threesomes with your 9-year-old son. Or you didn't know he was online? Yeah, well, we're a little bit concerned that he's been exposed to what might normalize unhealthy attitudes towards sex on the internet. And anyway, New Zealand's done some great public awareness campaigns about critical appraisal and how to think carefully. So I suggest anyone go on YouTube a couple of those clips if you can. But and then I'll turn over to Kahlil to get us back on somewhat of a reasonable track.
So I'm in charge of the segue from that one. I'm speechless. Yeah, I got nothing. Brett.
Question.
Kahlil, didn't you want to talk more about retail investing? Segue.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's a weird space. I don't know how much. So I think this is an area that, like, trying to get back to like the research perspective, is completely right. Like if somebody's working on or looking for a dissertation topic, I think that is a great wide open space to look at. There's only been like it's kind of been an afterthought from a gambling perspective of like, we're doing a prevalence study, or we're just going through a survey and we're listing all the different types of gambling activity that somebody could be wagering on. And then it comes down to like, do we include investing in there or not? And it's kind of like the last box that we tick off. And it's the first one we cut if the survey ends up being a minute too long. But I think what we're seeing in the United States right now, and I think this will happen in other countries as well, is one thing. It's great because it's like a democratization of the investment world and making it a lot easier for low income people to access, like sources of growing their wealth. So, like the Cash App is owned by Square, and part of Square's mission is to provide greater access to the whole financial system for people who don't have great access to it. So I think in the United States, something like 9%, I think, of the country is without a bank account, and even more than that are underbanked, which means they don't get a lot of key, banking services from the traditional system. So they might cash checks, but they don't cash checks to their banks because it's too much to pay like the monthly access fees. And so instead, when they do get a check, that they, go to a check cashing place, and they might pay a large percentage then, but they're not paying the fees to keep their deposits and withdraw them, every time they withdraw them. The Square's app, it ties a bank account to it. And it's actually a way that a lot of people got their CARES Act checks for $1,200 delivered to them, who otherwise would have had to wait for the checks to come in the mail for months. And so they, within that app, they have a section of it, one where you can buy Bitcoin, which is interesting, and two, where you can buy fractional shares, like I described, in a number of different companies, which means you're not even, like Apple's stock, I think, costs about $125, but you could still just invest $5 in it and get 525ths of, it's like the worst way to describe that fraction, of a share, and which is like a really great thing. But without the right context of what people are doing, a lot of people are definitely taking excessive risks on these apps. And I think, other platforms like Robinhood, it's not just stocks, it's also options where, you could be leveraging the amount of money that you have 100 times, and, all your money could go up in smoke in a week because the option expired next week. And, like unlike a stock where, the company would literally have to go bankrupt for it not to be worth anything. And so retail investing, I think, is a space that's very ripe for research, because I don't think we have a great sense of the share of people that are taking excessive risks on these sites and the scale of impacts that that has. So, like one of the things that we know about the way that people's intentions get formed to gamble is it's based on, their attitudes and then their social norms. So their attitudes is how much do they actually enjoy it? And their social norms is what is their peer group, whether that's their parents, whether that's like people that are their friends or colleagues or anybody else that's important to them. How do they feel about the activity? And I think in investing, it's a very different perception socially about what's good or not. And so because of that, we might see people engaging that activity much more and not necessarily feeling the same need to control their behavior that they would with typical online gambling as they would, even if they're just still, wagering, I'm using the word wagering loosely, but wagering significantly more amounts of money on stocks and options because it's just framed in a different way.
I think that's a great point, Kahlil. There's a really good, I have no idea if this is going to be a totally esoteric reference, but there's a famous American satirist, Ambrose Bierce, and he has a great quote that is, whenever Kahlil brings up this subject, I'm always reminded of it, which is, the gambling known as business looks with austere disfavor upon the business known as gambling. And I think that ties in, like what you're saying, it's very similar. The environment that surrounds the wagering, I'll use the same word, that's associated with markets is very different from a lot of what we see in what we would consider more, I guess, normal or standard gambling.
Yeah, and I think that sort of gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is the changing nature of gambling. And we have had, questions about, I expected more people to go online. I think there has been a shift that it shows, I think, the acceleration of a trend rather than, a massive move away from what people have been doing. But I think it will depend on how long the pandemic drags out and what happens in each jurisdiction in terms of shutdown or life as normal, back and forth in terms of what a different consumer impact is. Just as we're getting towards the end of the hour, what I'd like to close with is for each of us to go around and share what we think we'll be doing in 2021.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go Phil.
I have a non-answer. So I don't know. What I'm going to try to do is, I think it's very clear that many behaviors have changed and have changed permanently. What I don't think is clear is what the bounce back is going to be like once there's a vaccine. And I don't think it's clear what everybody, both in the field, but then out in the real world that's connected to our field, has been working on during 2020. And what I think we're going to see is a lot of changes on the policy front. So like the biggest determinant of expansion of gambling is fiscal crises. So, and we're going to have some of those next year. And so there's going to be a much bigger appetite for expanding legal forms of gambling, particularly in the United States, but I think worldwide. And so we're going to see that expansion. I think we're going to see that people have been working on different innovations within the space that are connected to what they see as going to be a wave of expansion. And so like, I think, in the United States, the context was sports betting's coming online. I think now people are starting to focus on, online gambling is not far behind sports here. And I think when investors and entrepreneurs see that, they also think, like what other problems or what other opportunities are there that exist in this space that can also, kind of travel along that wave with those tailwinds. And so when I think about what do I want to do, I think I want to maintain some optionality on seeing how some of these things play out, because I think, when we get into the second half of next year, I think we're going to have a much better idea of what the next 10 years looks like. So I don't want to overcommit myself today to a path when I think there could be a lot that will still change. And when we think about researchers, we're thinking about in multi-year periods. And so, I think it's important to just really stay tuned on what's coming next. I don't know, Brett, what do you think?
It was kind of a non-answer. Well done. I agree. I think those are really great points. I think I don't know if I agree on one aspect, which is really just that within the next year or so, we'll be able to know more about what the next 10 years will look like. And the disagreement really just stems from the fact that think back 10 years and how different everyday life was, because really to call in the theme of this entire seminar series, the technology, risk, and gambling, right? That's the G series, is how much technology especially has changed in our lives. And I think that that's really going to have a huge impact in how we come out of a pandemic like this. It certainly had a huge impact in how people have acted during the pandemic, not even necessarily the technology itself, but what technology permits, just this complete open and in many ways unfiltered distribution of information. Like Sally was describing some of these New Zealand PSAs, just in how people interact with others and how much we don't understand about the technology that we use in everyday life. And I'm really interested to see as we go into 2020, just how much of that is going to stick with us as we, at least we, maybe not Australia, which is already out of a pandemic apparently, come out of this and then move back into everyday life. I think it'll be a long time, for example, before we remove the plastic barriers between seats at the blackjack table, or have an empty seat. Every other slot machine will be open and the others will be blocked off. I think that we're really going to see a lot more interaction with the technology that we use and the spaces that we live in. And I think that's going to have a huge effect on 2021 and then also going forward. As for research itself, I think that I'm hoping rather that a lot of my research is going to continue down this channel of how we use that technology and what it is. How is this existing for me, especially in the gaming space? How is that changing as it continues to overlap with gambling? Just within the last few weeks, there have been new adaptations and new innovations in streaming that have changed how people think about using the, I guess I'll call it currency. It doesn't necessarily mean financial or monetary currency within streams. And so and then how that ties to gambling. And I'm curious to see how that's going to continue to change as we move forward and as people continue to use their computers as a communication device more and more.
Yeah, and for me, I think there's three main themes I'm looking at with my research team and collaborators. One is the changing gambling environment. So that's everything from digital payment mechanisms to the layout to online, how it's actually how gambling is actually provided, the product, the interaction with staff, the customer experience, which is very heavily tied to the second theme, which how can we use technology as a harm minimization? So one of the things digital currency or cashless payments provides is a mechanism for which to use automated risk monitoring software to start using algorithms to trawl through all that data and to flag risky play, to send customized, personalized messages at real time, to your mobile phone, even though you're playing on a gaming machine. So using that technology and the changing nature of the environment to engage in more customized, data-driven consumer protection strategies. And the third area is more related to the treatment. Obviously, the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic is a treatment clinic as well. And I think what's really become very apparent is that we need to have a much broader reaching approach to gambling treatment, that the people coming in don't only have issues with gambling, they have financial issues, they have legal issues, they have broader addiction and psychology issues. And we need to be providing greater engagement and referrals with all of the support services. And conversely, that there are a lot of support services out there that see people with gambling problems, but either don't screen, don't refer, don't identify them. So I see that as part of my role as a gambling treatment provider to be educating the broader professionals, nurses, financial counselors, legal aid workers, to start screening and identifying for, is there a gambling problem maybe underpinning or related to some of the issues that someone is presented for? Because we know from our research that the average person that comes in to see us might be 9 to 15 years into a gambling problem, and they've probably seen over 20 professionals during that time and have never been screened and referred, or that hasn't stuck for whatever reason. So that we need to be doing a greater job of actually engaging with the broader professional sectors to try and provide a more seamless transition, so that individual doesn't have to tell their story to 20 different people, but we're able to kind of bring that together and work as a social sector more cohesively. So that's something, obviously that's not something I'm going to achieve in 2021, but I'd very much like to start making inroads towards training professionals, because I think a lot of people just aren't comfortable to ask the questions about gambling because they don't have a good answer. So we can start providing people with a greater sense of confidence of, okay, if someone discloses gambling problems, I know what to do with that. So we need to start not just training the consumers, but actually training professionals in understanding gambling problems and knowing what steps to take. So they're my kind of three main areas. And there's quite a lot of that fall into each of those buckets.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's any one thing that has changed for the better and will have like a lasting effect that will only have a flywheel snowball effect, it's telehealth. I mean, that's a two-sided market, right? So we need consumers on one side to accept it, and we need doctors on the other. And like in the United States, like every insurance provider now provides access to telehealth. And we're seeing more tools that will help them navigate potential issues from a software standpoint, delivering into that treatment provision. And so like that's like one thing where I'm incredibly hopeful that it's a solution, but it's a solution that applies to every form of gambling. And with barriers to help seeking being like one of the biggest problems that we have as a field, it's like a wonderful shift in cultural norms that is going to make access so much easier.
It's pretty much bringing us up on closing time. We did have plenty to talk about in the end. We didn't even get to all the questions. Hopefully everyone who tuned in, first of all, thank you for tuning in. We have missed doing these, haven't we, Kahlil?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been a fun part of our routine. We very much do plan to rejig in 2021, regroup and launch a second season. At least that's the idea. So if you do have any suggestions for speakers or topics, please email us. We're very, very keen to make sure that what content we're providing is matching the content that is of interest to you all. We can have this conversation ourselves. We want to make sure we're providing something that's useful for the broader community. But it's been a real honor, actually, to be able to act in this role. This, as you might have heard me mention in some previous webinars, this really came about from a group of us just chatting online, talking about how we missed conferences and how unfortunate it was, particularly for the early career researchers that do use conferences as a launch pad, and that, well, if these people already potentially have presentations prepared, why shouldn't we provide an access? So again, a huge thanks to the Brain and Mind Center for hosting this and allowing us to bring you this content. And from me, just a huge thank you to everyone who has tuned in and shared with others about this webinar series and provided us with feedback. It's been a real honor. It's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure. And I'm sure I, can say the same from Kahlil, and obviously Brett's been on at least 2 so far. Feels like you've been involved in them all in the vaccines. Yeah, so thank you all, and best wishes. I feel like we've gone back to Elizabethan times, that my best wishes to you and your family for health. It is uncertain times. We've been a bit tongue-in-cheek today, but my sincere wishes to you and all of those around you for a healthy and happy holiday season wherever you are in the world. And we very much hope that we'll be speaking with you virtually, most likely in 2021, maybe gearing up towards real world conferences again the following year, all things considered. Kahlil, did you have any closing comments?
Happy holidays, everybody.